Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm so glad that you're joining me today. I'm going to be chatting about editing film scans. So I'm going to go through some galleries from 3 years ago to some galleries from today or in the last few months. And I'm going to show you guys the small adjustments that I make and sometimes big adjustments, especially if my exposure was off or the colors were a little bit weird, funky skin tones, that kind of thing. So hopefully this video will help you learn to play around in Lightroom and make the adjustments yourself. Now, as you work more with your lab and they start to know your preferences more, you won't need to do as much editing to your film scans. There's a lot of times now where I'll get my scans back and they already look probably 95% and I'm just adding some sharpening. But then there's other times where I still need to fix the skin tones or the greens weren't the way I wanted them. So there are sometimes more adjustments that I need to make. But again, over the course of years, you should grow a strong relationship with your lab. So when you get those premium scans back, they're pretty much good to go. So let's get right into it. I'm going to pull up a wedding that I shot 3 years ago now, back in 2017. And this was a beautiful outdoor wedding, as you can see. Beautiful lighting, all natural lights. It was an outdoor ceremony, outdoor tent wedding. So the images turned out pretty good. But at this point, I mainly shot at 2.0, which isn't good on the Contax. I mean, it looks amazing, but a lot of times where you'll end up with film flatness or it just not looking that sharp, especially the edges. So I don't recommend shooting at 2.0. It's definitely better to shoot at 2.8 and up, especially for far away shots. So there's some small adjustments that I would just make to these with the contrast and some sharpening. So I'll go ahead and just kind of show you guys what I would do here. So for this image, I would probably just reduce the vignetting here, bring that up. That looks pretty good. On almost all my film scans, I'm always bringing up the luminance, especially for people. So if there's skin tones in the photos, I like to bring up the luminance, which just kind of softens the skin. And then I will bring up the sharpening after that. So usually about 20 for luminance. And then the sharpening can go anywhere from 50 to, even if I need 100, let's say the image is pretty soft. But most of the time I'm sitting around 60. So this image already looks pretty much good to go. I do like to kind of play with the tone curve a bit. Typically I am bringing up my highlights, bringing up the shadows, and then this last little dot that I add here will just kind of add back in some contrast to those shadows. So most of my tone curve always looks like an S. This is a really small version of an S, but it typically kind of starts up. But in the middle, it goes to the highest point, and then it comes back down for the third point. So that image is good to go. Just kind of freshened it up, cleaned it up. Back in 2017, I didn't really edit my film scans. I didn't know that that was something that you could do or that you should do. So probably back then I delivered this image just how it was, like this. But now, whenever I edit my digital and my film, I'm always making small adjustments to my film just to make it that much better. So don't be scared to get in there and edit your film scans and add a little bit of sharpening. That's fine too. So for this image, again, just gonna add some sharpening here. I already like the colors. It looks pretty good. It's a little bit shadowy and contrasty, so I might just bring up the highlights right there. I don't want to add any more contrast down here, so I'd probably leave that. Reduce the contrast a little bit here. And then I do like to play with the temperature and the tint. So for this image, it is a little bit on the green side. When there's a lot of greens in the photo, I do like to bring up the magenta a bit, which will help their skin tones, especially if it's a shot where there's a lot of skin tone in greens. The greens can really reflect and bounce off all that greens onto their skin. And so that's when I do like to use the tint and bring up that magenta, so it really helps their skin tone and it brings it back to that nice pinky tone. Okay, that image looks pretty good. Oops. Just an image like this, even though it's just a detail shot, I can see that there just seems like to be a lot of yellows and greens, obviously. And the way I'm seeing that is especially on the trunks of the trees. I can notice that. So I'll just go ahead and bring up the tint, bring it up the magenta a bit, and then already it's a small adjustment, but I notice it a lot. And I'd probably just sharpen this image as well. Okay, so for an image like this, again, I'm just going to apply my luminance and sharpening. And then there is a lot of contrast here, especially in the suit. And then there's a lot of blues on the pathway. So I'm going to go ahead and play with the tone curve first. Just bringing up those shadows there. So typically I'm always playing with the tone curve, and then I'll go ahead and make the rest of the adjustments here. I personally just find the tone curve easier to do my contrast and exposure adjustments, but there's really no right way or wrong way of doing it. So I'm going to pull up the shadows even more right there. So already you can see there's a huge difference between the two. Especially if you want that soft and airy look, then you got to reduce that contrast. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring up the magentas just a little bit, maybe to 10. The warmth up a little bit. Oops. And then I do like to play with the HSL color sliders. So I'll play with the yellows, the greens, and the oranges, usually the most. So you can see how the yellow is really affecting those greens in the background, which can actually be really nice, especially if you have a really green background and just tons of trees. Then adding some yellow and bringing that hue negative down back this way will really help not make those greens as vibrant. But in this scenario, I don't want to play with it too much. I like the way it looks. And sometimes there's a little bit red on their skin, especially with film, so you can always come in here and play with the red as well. Overall, that looks pretty good. If I wanted to remove the blue from the path, I would just go in here with the HSL color slider, and I can easily play with the blue and kind of tone it down a bit. So there you go, that looks pretty good. So this is another beautiful image, but it just needs a few adjustments to make it even better. Go ahead and bring up those shadows, bring up the contrast. I want my images to appear soft, so the less contrast will help it look softer. And then I might bring up the magenta. That looks beautiful. And then I will make small adjustments sometimes if I do notice a pimple or anything like that. I'll just quickly use the spot tool and then remove it just like that. And then a little trick that I do sometimes, when you're shooting Fuji 400, if you overexpose it 3 or even 4 stops, you start to get more pink in your photographs. And I really personally like that. I like the whites having a little bit more pink. I like the skin tones being a little bit pink. But sometimes that doesn't always happen with my film scans. So I'll actually go into the tone curve and go to the red channel. And this is how I add in that little bit of pink to my photographs whenever I want them, especially to the digital. This is great for when I'm editing the digital to match my film. This gives me that little bit of pink in my digital photos as well. So what you do is you just grab the top there of the dot, and then you just slide it so slightly to the left there. See, even that was too much. You can see it in the veil and in the whites that it was too much of an adjustment. So it's really just like one little thing over like that. And then you can also make the background in your Lightroom white, so that way you can see how the white looks in the photo to the white on the background. And it will help you see how red you just made the image. So that one looks really good. And I'm just going to apply all the adjustments and see what happens. Still a little too contrasty, so I'm just going to edit this one from scratch here. Sometimes you don't want to bring the contrast down too much because then the highlights start looking too they start looking kind of dull. So that's why I don't like to bring the highlights down too much, because you can see it kind of looks gray now. But sometimes I'll just bring them down a tiny, tiny bit. And with this image, there is a lot of green, so I'm gonna bring up that magenta. I'm gonna come down to HSL. I'm gonna add in that yellow. See how that really changes the background there, which looks beautiful, adds in a little bit of reds and pinks. Sometimes I'll even do the luminance and brighten up the background even more. And then can remove the blue a little bit in the path here. So that image looks pretty good. If I wanted to, I could add in a tiny bit of red there as well. Overall, that looks really good. And then I have an image like this where now there's a lot of contrast. We're shooting in an all green space, and I was shooting this at 2.0. And so you can see that there's a lot of softness and a lot of things out of focus. So obviously I've learned since 2017. I'm just going to add a lot of sharpness actually to this image. Sometimes I'll even bring up the radius for a shot like this where they're probably not going to blow it up into a big shot, but at least I can sharpen it for, you know, the gallery. So already that sharpness helped a bunch. And then I'm going to go ahead and remove the vignetting here. Then I'm going to go straight to the RGB, bring up those highlights there, bring up the shadows, really just brighten the whole photograph, but I don't want to lose the highlights either. And you can see already it's looking so much better. Now I'm going to go ahead and play with the tint. And when I'm playing with the tint, what I'm looking at is the chairs. So if I see the chairs start turning too purple or red looking, then I've probably gone too far. So I'm going to bring that down, and probably just to 1720 is probably good. And even just a little bit of warmth will help this photograph as well. And then right down to the HSL color sliders, can kind of play with the greens. Maybe I'll desaturate the greens a bit, which is kind of nice because then it just kind of draws your attention away from all the out of focus parts of the image. And then let's add more yellow to the greens. And again, bring up the luminance, can look great sometimes. Get rid of the busyness. So that looks pretty good. Okay, gonna add some sharpness. And then again, this image just has a lot of contrast because, you know, it's at 2 p.m. or mid-sun, mid part of the day. So it just needs a little less contrast and magenta. Something like that. Okay. So again, with all these images, I would just do the same thing. With these sunset portraits, they turn out really nice, so I wouldn't have to do too much with these ones. If anything, maybe I would come and just do a little bit of skin retouching here. This one, you know, could use a little bit less contrast as well. Sometimes I don't pull up too high on the highlights either, because you can see in an image like this, the dress is already pretty blown out. So sometimes I might just keep it at the same point, same level as the line there. and then I can bring up the shadows without changing the highlights. Again, just pull down the contrast up here and then add in magenta. And again, I'm just looking at her dress, seeing how much pink is showing up, looking in the shadows. Is there a lot of, red showing up down here when I'm changing the magenta? You can see that it really shows in the shadows. So just being aware as you're changing these things, even on the suit, you can really see how much the magenta is affecting it. So I probably only bring that up to 7. And maybe even a little bit of warmth. That looks pretty good. Just apply the same to the next image. And with an image like this where the flowers are a bit blown out, I could even come in here and use the brush, selective brush, highlight everything that is blown out, the flowers specifically, and then what I could do is bring down those highlights just manually, which only affects the flowers, and that way I'm not losing details in those flowers. This happens when it's a really sunny day, they're in shadow. You can see that they're kind of in the shadow, but the flowers are hitting the sun, and the flowers are also white, which, just even more so reflect the sun. So that already looks better, just being able to see the flowers and the details better. And the florist will like that image a lot better as well. And then what you could do is also go down to the HSL color slider, and you could also play with that as well. Okay, so let's see what else we got here. So this is an image I already edited. So I did the same things. I really played with the tone curve, played with the sharpness, the luminance, the vignetting for sure. And then I did add some magenta back into the photograph as well. So that looks much better to me. Okay, so this is like one of my favorite photographs, but when you see it right now, it doesn't even look the best. So I'm going to go ahead and add sometimes not too much luminance, especially when it's not a couple's portrait. So I wouldn't add too much to a details photograph. Now I'm going to bring the sharpening right up, fix the vignetting there, and then I'm going to go right to the tone curve and bring up those highlights, bring up the shadows. Don't really need to add contrast back in because I can still see that there's a lot of contrast in the greens. That already helps a lot. I can see that there is more green and yellow to the photograph though, which is not what I want. I do want a little bit more warmer reddish tones. So you can see right here by just playing with the tint, it makes a huge difference. So even at like 12, that looks a lot better. You can kind of just play around. Sometimes I'll put images side by side. So if you press Shift R, then you can put 2 images side by side, bring in a reference photo, and then that way you can kind of see how the whole gallery is looking. This is great, especially for film and digital matching. That way you can put the film images as your reference and you can go ahead and edit your digitals here. And it just makes it a lot easier to match the two. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And then I'll just apply the same to this photo. Wow, and already you can see makes a huge, huge difference. Probably a little too bright in this for this photo. I don't want to lose all those gorgeous drapery and the highlights and the draping right there. Probably could bring up the pinks even a little bit more. Now when I put them side by side, that looks great. Okay, so an image like this, I obviously underexposed, and you can just see that it's a little bit muddy looking. It's a little bit flat, more matte looking. It doesn't stand out. It's not very vibrant. And so that means that I've underexposed the image. So what I would do here is sharpen, as always. Bring up the vignetting. Again, because this isn't a photo that they're probably going to print huge on their wall, I don't mind bringing the sharpening right up. Just helps it look sharper in the gallery, and it's nicer for them to look at it as well. And then I could just see that there was a little bit fringing happening with the lettering. So if that happens, then you just go into lens corrections, manual, and then you can kind of play with the amount. So you can see it right there in the welcome. So I'll just bring the slider over, and that gets rid of it. Now you do have to be careful if you do have any purple in the photograph, like if you were doing that with bridesmaids dresses or flowers that are purple, then it would affect that as well. But thankfully this photo is all green, so I don't have to worry about anything else that's purple in there. So now I'm gonna go ahead and bring up the exposure to kind of fix my underexposure there. At first it's going to look funny, but after I brought up the highlights and the shadows, then I can come back down and just bring back in that contrast. So once I've done that, then I can see that the image is still really green. It's really green looking, so go ahead and bring the magenta way up. And then you can kind of just play with it to go how your eye feels, just how you see it. I can go back and change a couple things. Bring down the highlights up here as well. That already looks so much better. And then, of course, the HSL color sliders. I would definitely bring yellow back into this photograph to help balance out all the greens. And you can see the luminance just kind of brightens everything. And that looks pretty good. Maybe, okay, a little bit contrasty if I do that. Okay, so I think that's good with these images. Let's see. Now let's see. This is a wedding that I think I also shot in 2017. I'm showing you guys more of my older photographs just because they need way more editing. Now, Photovision gets pretty close with my scans that I get now, but I also just shoot better. Shoot at 2.8, I shoot at 4.0 if I need to. And my exposures are a lot more accurate. I feel like when I first started film, I was underexposing, and that really scared me when I would get my scans back and they were muddy. So then I went the complete opposite, and then I was overexposing a lot, which is what you see happening here. So now I just try to even it out, not underexpose, but only overexpose by a couple stops. So first I'm just going to straighten this photograph to make the lines with the window here straight with the photograph. That's typically what I'm looking at, is the background, and just making sure that everything looks nice and straight. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just add some noise reduction, add some sharpening there. Can't tell if it looks completely straight, but okay. And then what I would do here is, even though it's overexposed, I still want to bring up the shadows to lessen the contrast. So I would just bring those up, but keep the highlights down. And already I like that I'm seeing more details in these greens. I'm going to bring up the vignetting. That helps a lot. The greens are looking a little too bluey green to me, so I'd probably even slide that back down a bit to be more yellow green. And then even with the yellows, I might just bring the yellows down. This is a good time to use the luminance to bring the highlights back into the yellow, so back into the flowers. If I bring the luminance down, you can see that there's the detail coming back into them right there. So that already looks so much better. I think I was shooting portrait for here too because we were inside, so that's also why the colors are a bit different than usual. But yeah, that looks pretty good. Sometimes I'll kind of play around with the other channels in the tone curve just to see if anything's working, if it needs anything else. But I think that looks pretty good. Let's go to the next one. And I'm just going to apply the previous one, which didn't really look good. So I'll just quickly do some adjustments. The vignetting, the tone curve. Oh, this one I actually already edited. So you can see the difference with bringing the highlights back into the flowers here. And I did all the same adjustments. You can see that I brought the yellows, even the saturation down a bit because it was a bit too yellow for my liking. And then I did bring the luminance to get the detail into those flowers. Probably do the same thing to this one. And yeah, that looks much better, but it's still a little bit dark. Bring up the shadows a bit more here. If you ever need to delete one of these little dots, you just double click and that will reset that dot. So bring up the shadows and then I'll go ahead and add a little bit of contrast there. And that will help that scan look a bit better. Okay, and then an image like this, I can see that there's just a lot of greens happening. It doesn't really have that warm tone to it or the pink tone. So I'll just make the small adjustments, the vignetting, the sharpening, and then I'll go ahead and again, just lift those shadows just a little bit here because everything looks pretty good in terms of exposure here, but I might bring down the contrast a little bit. And then I really want to bring the magenta back in. And again, just looking at the whites and seeing how they're reacting to the magenta. Yeah, it doesn't need too much magenta. Probably +9 looks good. Maybe I'll bring the highlights back down. I definitely don't want to, lose the highlights in the dress and in the veil. Those are important details. Sometimes you can use even just the brush and you could kind of paint back in some of those details as well. I'm going to bring down the yellows. You can see how just bringing down the yellows really warms up the photograph too. So from that to that. So that makes a huge difference, just doing those small adjustments. Makes it more of my style, adding in that warmth and the pinky tones. And then of course, with this green, I would either edit that out or maybe I could just crop in. But I'd probably edit it out just because I like seeing the top of the building there. So that's something I could either use my little brush here or I could bring it into Photoshop quickly. But it seems like that tool worked pretty well. It's those small little details that you think are insignificant, but they do just make like a huge difference in the final product in your gallery as a whole. So I'd probably start over with my editing for this portrait, but just to show you guys quickly of, the before and after. See, I don't like crushing the highlights too much where it just becomes kind of flat looking. I like keeping that pop and that contrast to them. And then if her skin was looking too red, then I could come in here, bring down the reds a bit, and then probably play with the orange actually, and just bring the orange to the right which will take out the reds as well. Even bring her skin tone back in a bit by using the luminance there. So there you go, before and after. It looks much, much better. Okay, so let's go to the next one. Let's do a stationary calligraphy edit because I know that this can be a tricky one for a lot of people. So first, whenever I see the stationary shot, I like to do the cropping and adjusting to make sure that everything looks straight. And so sometimes what I'm doing is having to play with the transform tool down here. I never use auto, I always do everything manually. But for the most part with stationary, I find that I'm having to go to lens corrections and play with the distortion. And usually I'm having to go plus. So +6 or +7. You can see when I go that way, it kind of comes back out. But once I go this way, it starts to correct it. It looks better. And I'm always looking at the grid lines and making sure the grid lines line up straight with the stationary edges. So just looking at the paper and making sure that the line is straight next to it. You can see there that it's not straight anymore, but if I go around here, that looks pretty good. And then I might just zoom in a bit using the scale there. And already that looks much better. With this one, it doesn't need too much, but I might play with the vertical. And again, I'm just looking at the paper to make sure that all of the lines with all of the paper look straight. And then definitely adding some sharpening for this as well. Stationary needs quite a bit of sharpening sometimes, especially, I think I was only shooting at 2.8 maybe. I didn't have a tripod for this. Otherwise, I think it's good to shoot stationary at 4.0 or 5.6 with the Contax. And that way you know that from corner to corner you're going to get sharpness and that you're not going to get, you know, this looking soft and even this side of the paper looking soft. But that looks pretty good. And then it looks a little bit flat, so I would go ahead and just bring up the highlights a touch. Bring the contrast back down. And that way it just kind of pops a bit more. Looks pretty good. And then we have this stationary suite. I'm just going to go ahead and sharpen it first. So already the sharpness just helps so much with these stationary suites. And then what I would do is either crop or just come down to the transform, and I can actually rotate there and make sure my lines are straight. Scale it, so I'm going to bring it closer. So you can see that already makes a huge difference. And to know whether to play with it more, especially the vertical transformation, is if the top part is looking bigger or closer to the camera than the bottom, if you see that it kind of falls off and the bottom looks farther away, then you know you're probably not straight over the stationary. Maybe you were a little bit too forward. So that's when the vertical transformation will come in handy. And the same is with the horizontal. Maybe you were, you know, photographing a little bit on an angle, like you weren't completely straight, which happens. So that's why these adjustments will really come in handy. And yeah, just making that small adjustment to the vertical, I can see really helps it. So that looks a lot better. Wouldn't do too much else. Maybe I would play with the yellows because as I'm looking in the shadows down here, I can see there's a little bit more green tint and a little bit yellow tint. So if I just kind of play with the yellow sliders, you can see it's affecting the wax seal as well there. Bring them over a bit. There we go, that looks pretty good. Okay, and then this is a really beautiful image, but I was shooting Fuji 400, and I believe my settings were at 2.8, probably at a 60th. Excuse me. And so it was a little bit underexposed than I usually would shoot it. So there are some adjustments that I would make just to add that contrast back into the photograph and help her skin tone to look a little bit more luminance as well. Can't speak apparently. So bring up the noise reduction, add some sharpening in there, and then I'm going to go ahead and bring up the highlights and the shadows. That's already making just everything look a little bit more contrasty and pop a bit more from the photograph, whereas this looks really dull before. But now you can see that there's a little bit more pop, the whites are popping, and then I'm gonna fix the vignetting as well. That's just kind of happening around the corners. Looks a lot better. See a lot of yellow in her skin. I'm gonna go ahead and bring up the tint. Probably +6, +7. And then this is where I would go in and play with the yellows because her skin is looking a little yellow. Maybe not too much. I think the orange actually. And I'd probably bring the orange down a little bit to add the red back into the skin tone, so it kind of takes away from that yellow look. I can play with the red as well, but it was mostly the orange that was affecting the skin. So you can see the skin looks really yellow here, and then now it has more of a pinky, softer skin tone to it. And that is because of the film stock and it being a bit underexposed. So that skin tone just looks more natural and everything pops a bit more in the photograph. Again, this image looks pretty well exposed, but I'm just going to make some sharpening adjustments, some of the vignetting to get rid of it. I believe I was shooting with the Mamiya here with the 45mm on, which is a nice angle to get. Just doing my little S curve that I usually do. And this image looks pretty good. There's not too much that I would do to it. Just adding in more of the pink, whether I do it with the magenta or I could even come into the tone curve to the red channel and I could just slightly pull that over. Again, it's just the smallest amount. That looks really beautiful. I'm gonna apply the same adjustments and you can see the difference that it makes with the overall image. I'm gonna bring up the noise reduction there just to soften the noise. And the sharpening is pretty good just because this was actually shot on my Mamiya, again, with the 45mm, and that's a really sharp lens. So I love how everything looks really crystal in this photograph. Beautiful. Okay, so I think that's pretty good for that one. And then a couple from this shoot. So this was a year ago, and I believe I was shooting a mix of Portra 400 and 800. And what I learned, especially after this shoot, is that Portra 400 likes to be rated at 400. And I think I maybe overexposed it too much, which you can see in the highlights here, just that they're kind of already blown out, that her skin tone looks off. It looks more orange. So I learned after this that Portra 400, you need to rate it close to 400. Otherwise, the skin tones can look funky. And then Portra 800, it is a film stock that likes to be overexposed. So you can expose it at 400 or even 640 and still get beautiful results. But Portra 400 is a little bit more picky. So in a scenario like this, how I would fix the skin tone is, first of all, add the sharpening. I'm going to go ahead and go to the tone curve and I'm going to bring down the highlights there. Not too much because there's only so much you can bring back on a film scan. but just bring them down a little bit and then bring up the shadows, get rid of all that moody type of look and the contrast that's happening there. And I wouldn't bring the contrast back down because it still looks like it has quite a bit. So already her skin, the transition from the one side of her face to the other, everything looks much softer than it does here. So already just those small adjustments really make a difference. And then to help with her skin tone, I'd probably bring up the tint and just looking at the whites in the photograph and making sure that I didn't go too far, but that looks like the right amount of magenta. And then even the warmth, I feel like this image is a little on the cooler side, so it could use a tiny bit of warmth. And then what I'm really going to do is, well, first of all, I'll just straighten that. Go ahead and play with the skin tones. So I'm going to grab the orange HSL color slider. And her skin does look more orange, so I'd probably bring it to the left to the red a bit. And then maybe even bring down the saturation. Sometimes I need to do that as well because film can really bring out the red in people's skin. Already that looks great. Maybe go to the red channel. I'll just kind of play around till I get what I like. But I'm looking at her lips here, which really show the red. And I do like having them look more red than the rest of her skin. You can see here if I bring them too much to the right, then they turn more orange and kind of blend in with her skin. But if I bring them to the left, then it really makes them pop and brings back that color into them. So I'll probably keep it over there. And yeah, that image looks great. That's probably all I would do for that one. I'm going to apply the same to this one. And it looks like it worked. It's lacking a little bit of luminance to it. So I would probably just fix the highlights, not have them come down as far, and then bring up the shadows a bit more. This image wasn't as overexposed, and you can see the face. There's not different lighting on each side, so I don't need to bring the highlights back down as much. I'd probably even bring up the exposure a bit to get that really beautiful bright look to it. Add some color back into the skin tone. Sometimes I'll even bring up the saturation, bringing it more towards the red, just a little bit towards the red. And then I might even bring up the saturation on the red as well. Kind of play with the contrast. That looks pretty good. The flowers look good. They don't look blown out. Could go into the red channel and add a tiny bit of red to the photograph. And that looks beautiful. Go ahead and apply the same thing to this photo. Looks great. I'm going to take away the red. Oh, no, I like the red. Again, you don't want the reds to be too much where now your whites are looking too pink. And that's why it helps having this white background for my Lightroom to be able to contrast the two. This is a little bit maybe too pink. So I just want a tiny bit. Go ahead and apply it. You can see how the tone curve just really brings up those shadows and lessens the contrast. Okay, let's go to this image. Now I'll show you guys how I would fix this. So you can see in the shadows, there's also these bluey greens. The highlights are kind of blown out. Everything has like a kind of a green tint to it. Even in the cherry, you can see that. And again, that's just because it's probably Fuji 400 that I've overexposed too much. So I'll go ahead and bring down the highlights just a touch, bring up the shadows. And then what I really want to play with here is the tint and the temperature. So definitely going to bring up the tint. I don't want it to become too pinkish blue, but probably to 15. And then add in just like a tiny bit of warmth there. So that already makes a huge difference, just taking away that contrast. And this kind of shows you that film scans can be fixed. And this might even be something that you want to show to the lab as well, so they scan it differently next time. I mean, there's only so much they can do also when you haven't exposed correctly or because of the type of film stock, but it is good to send side-by-sides back to your lab when you've edited a session and you had to do quite a bit of adjustments. Specifically when you're working with greens or skin tones, I like to send side-by-sides back to the lab after and just kind of let them know that these are my preferences, if they could look more like that. But always try to ask questions with your lab because they know a lot. And most of the time it isn't their fault, it is our fault in how we shoot and how we what film stocks we use, how we light the situation. But the scanning does make a difference as well. So then from here, I would go ahead and play with the yellows a bit. Probably just bringing down the luminance again. I don't want to lose the detail in those flowers. I can see there's still a lot of green happening. I don't want to lose the green, but I might just soften it a bit by lowering the saturation there. And that looks pretty good. Let's see the next one. Again, that's just the same one that I just applied. This one is a bit more overexposed, so I might have to bring down the highlights even more there. The chair's looking a little too red, so I'd probably bring back down the tint and then take away some of that warmth as well that's kind of happening. Yeah, that looks much better there. This one looks a lot better with those adjustments applied. Sometimes I don't want the highlights to become too flat. So you don't always need to bring all the highlights back, but just bring it back a little bit there. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Even with images like these where the skin is a little on the oranger side, I probably would play with the orange a bit as well. Sometimes decreasing the saturation even by just 5. It's a subtle difference, but to me, it does make a difference. So that looks better like that. See that one? Yeah, I like the way that looks. And you can see how the luminance just really softens the skin tone. But I still like to add sharpening. This was shot at probably 2.0 because you can see the fall off there. But yeah, that's without luminance. And then when you add luminance, you can just really see how it softens the skin, the pores, everything. See, I probably could fix this sun flare that's happening if I wanted to. I'd probably have to target it with the brush. Specifically, I'll just target the hair. I don't know why it already applies these things. Okay, so once I've highlighted the hair with the brush tool, then I'd probably take away, bring down the saturation would help. And then I could also play with the tint and bring it more towards the green, which will get rid of that sun flare, and that orange could bring down the temperature a bit, which would also help get rid of the orange. And let's see. Yeah, you can see that that makes a big difference. Here is a sun flare, and then there Oops, there it just looks more normal and just looks like her hair color. So that's one way that you can kind of get rid of sun flare if it happens in your photos. There's also this dehaze button. If your whole photo is washed out from sun flare, that you could try using the dehaze. Might help a little bit. Okay, so, and lastly, I just wanted to, one second, actually, I'm going to show you quickly some shots from France. You can see that the greens are really bright in this photograph. It's beautiful, but the greens aren't as soft as this photograph. They're just a little bit too contrasty. So again, something I would do here is keep the highlights on the line, but bring up the shadows just a little bit, bring down the contrast a little bit, bring back in the magenta to really help the skin tones look pinky. There's a lot of greens in this photo. And then I could also play with the HSL color slider and just bring down the saturation a bit. And I think that already just looks so much softer and cleaner than I did before. So we could apply that to this one as well. You can see it just makes a huge difference. And then when we were shooting these stationary, these invites and everything, it was pretty gloomy, pretty dark out, and we were shooting them inside on a mat with just a window light. And it was very hard because the mat was a darker tone and then the stationary was fairly bright. So there's just a lot of contrast happening between the background and the stationary. And so you can see that I probably overexposed it a little bit much, but again, with film, there's so much flexibility that I know I could bring it back. And so even if I just pull down the highlights here, bring up the shadows just a touch, and then add a little bit more contrast, you can see already the difference that it makes. And now I can see the text and add some sharpness, and just makes a huge difference. That looks way better. And then again, if I do just apply the same thing here, go in, adjust it, make sure everything's straight, and that looks much better. Okay, and then the last thing that I want to show you is an image like this where it's so beautiful, it has so much potential, but there's just so many people in the photograph. So this is when I would take it into Photoshop, get out of Lightroom, take it into Photoshop, and this is where I would do the cloning and the adjustments from there rather than trying to fix it in Lightroom. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and grab the clone tool. My computer is pretty slow as well, so I'm sorry if things slow down a little bit here. Need to get a new computer ASAP. But wedding season is kind of pushed back, so there's not a rush now, which is kind of nice. Can save up a bit more. So yeah, I don't need it to be too perfect for an image like this. You know, they're not going to zoom in. They're not going to notice these small little things. It's not the focus of the picture. As long as everything looks fairly blended, I'm just cloning from different rocks. I don't want to clone right to the next rock right next to them. So I usually choose a rock's couple ways it down, and that way if I choose rocks over here, it will make the photograph look different and won't look cloned. So again, that's what I would do, and I would just keep doing that. And you can see when you zoom out, you don't really notice that spot. I might fix the rocks just a little bit so it's all even there. And then again, I would just clone some rocks from the edges. Probably clone some rocks from over here at this point, and I'll just tackle all of their feet and their legs. Again, I try not to focus too much on making it perfect because then it would take forever, and I can kind of fix everything afterwards. So even rocks like that, I can just clone out afterwards. And then now I would focus on the water and just cloning the water over top. Might even make my brush smaller here and just really get in nice and close. And almost there. Now I can clone the side of the rock. And then now I can go in and kind of fix these rocks. Maybe I'll take some rocks from this side and kind of clone that over. And then there we go, it looks natural. So there you go. Just a quick little edit there, and it just makes a huge difference. You know, you don't want to see any people in these types of photographs because it's supposed to feel like we're the only ones there, and it's supposed to feel secluded. So that's kind of the look that we want. And then I really want to clean up this beach as well. I do want it to look natural, but I think it will make a huge difference if everything just looks nice and soft and clean. And so I'll just go ahead and start cloning the different spots, cloning really close to it so that way it all looks natural. And then even zoom out. At this point, I would just grab a bigger brush so that way you're not seeing any brush strokes in the final edit. And really getting the corners as well, because that's where the vignetting can happen, and it just looks nice and clean when you get the corners. And so yeah, I would keep just selecting different parts. I don't want it to look too much of the same. I still want to see those little sand patches and everything, but I do want to edit out just like the big spots. So, and you want to make sure that it all looks the same as well. Now, I would take a little bit more time if I was doing this on my own, and I can even grab some spots and kind of blend it in so that way it's not all looking the same or getting the same pattern. Then I can kind of mix it up, grab some sand from over there, mix it in. But I definitely would want to take away the shadows and make everything look consistent. The lighting looks consistent now across the sand. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Again, I would just go in close and make it a little bit more consistent, but that looks pretty good. I haven't added any sharpness to it yet. And then I'll sometimes use this tool, which is the burn tool. This is either the dodge or the burn. So this is the dodge tool, which actually brightens parts of the photographs. So I only like to have it at like 5%. If I go to 100%, it really brightens that part of the photo. So I like to just go to 5%, something really small, and then I'll go ahead and just kind of apply it over the sand, and that will also create a brighter look and make the whole image nice and clean. Well, I forgot to undo the one that I put on them, so now that it's undone, I'm going to go ahead and do that again, brighten up the sand, and then I could just brighten them up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to bring this back into Lightroom, and that way we can see the difference that it made in the photograph. Okay, so there you go. This is before, and this is after. Before, it was not a photo that you could hang on the wall, and after, it's a beautiful photo that you could get printed nice and big and hang up, and it looks gorgeous. So there you go. There are some tips that I use on editing my film scans, just helping them look a little bit better, adding that sharpness, not being afraid to make those adjustments to make your film scans look the best that they can. I've even been going through old galleries on my site, since I'm obviously not going to be shooting another wedding for, I don't know how long, maybe a few months, maybe a year. So I've actually gone back through the galleries on my site and I've brought them back in a Lightroom, and I've been adjusting the film scans more, adding the sharpness into them, and re-uploading them into like a different blog style. So adding more like images next to each other and just creating a really creative layout. And already when I've done that, I've noticed a huge difference in my galleries. To me, it almost looks like a brand new wedding after I've done those small adjustments. So I think it's really important that maybe if you don't have new work to show or a new wedding that you really love, at least go through your old wedding galleries and make those small adjustments, curate your gallery so you're only showing the best images, but you're also showing the moments between family members, between the bridal party, moments where people are laughing, they're having fun. Because that way, when a client goes through the gallery, they're seeing photos of everybody enjoying themselves. They're not seeing all bride and groom portraits that look perfect. They are seeing every part of the day. In that way, they have the confidence knowing we're not only going to get beautiful photographs, but we're also going to have the most special moments captured, and we're going to have our guests captured. So if you have the time, which I think we all do right now, go through those old galleries and refresh them, make them look brand new. It's the best use of our time right now for sure. And I hope that this video was helpful for you guys. If you have any questions or any topics for the next video, just make sure to put those in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe as well, so that way you'll see when a new video comes out. I hope you guys have an amazing rest of your week, and I'll see you in the next video.